This is the lecture for Module 5, Interaction Dynamics. In your reading this week, you learned about conflict styles, which are patterned responses or clusters of behavior that people use when they're in conflict. We all have preferences with regard to the conflict styles that we think work best for us, and these preferences develop over our lifetimes based on a pretty complex blend of our personal characteristics, life experiences, and family background. We learned that people can engage in conflict along a kind of a continuum between avoidance of the conflict altogether or engagement in the conflict. And so we're going to start today by talking about a conflict pattern known as the avoid-criticize loop. And the avoid-criticize loop is simply a tactic in which we avoid directly communicating with a person to solve a conflict, but instead we spend our time and energy talking about the conflict or talking about the other person to third parties who might not even be involved in the conflict. The avoidance and criticism loop is actually pretty common in the business world, where people often are uncomfortable confronting a person face to face, and so what they'll do is they'll talk about the person or the problem behind that person's back. We can make the other person appear to be wrong without giving them a chance to actually correct their behavior and correct the problem. Now, there are many different forms of avoiding. They include things like simply not speaking when we have a chance to speak and correct a situation. Or if someone asks us directly, we might refuse to answer or say that we don't have an opinion or we really don't care. Sometimes we avoid by deflecting or simply changing the topic of conversation. We can avoid by actually physically leaving a situation. And one type of avoidance that's kind of interesting is postponement, which is a tactic that can work, but it works best when several conditions are present. And most importantly, we need to be able to acknowledge the emotional conflict or content of our conflict, although we may be able to put off talking about the particular topic until a later time. So for example, if I'm in a conflict with a person, I might say, well, I'm feeling really angry right now, so I don't think I'm going to be able to address this the way it needs to be handled. Let's come back and talk about it at another time. And this whole idea of working it out later also needs to be set up very carefully, because the person has to trust that you're going to be able to solve the problem and that you're not simply deflecting and putting it off indefinitely. So although avoidance comes in many different forms, its function is always to deflect or to avoid or otherwise not engage in the conflict. In contrast with the avoiding conflict style, a dominating conflict style is a very competitive power over style that's characterized by aggressive and uncooperative behavior. In other words, people who are pursuing their own concerns at the expense of others. A dominating conflict style tends to reflect a very high concern for self, but a very low concern for others. However, the dominating style of managing conflict can be productive, but only if you're competing to accomplish your individual goals without destroying the other person. And to do that, you need to keep the positive focus on the relationship, even while you're debating the topic at hand. Now, one type of domination tactic is the threat. And threats can be very destructive at times, although sometimes they can be constructive. For example, threats can be used constructively to highlight the importance of a particular topic to you. It can help you to get the attention of the other party in the conflict, and it can also help to clarify your perceptions of the power imbalance that you may be feeling. On the other hand, threats tend to start escalatory conflict spirals because when I threaten you, you may be tempted to threaten me in exchange. And so threats can often block collaborative agreements, and ultimately they can undermine trust in the relationship. A person who wants to use threats as a conflict tactic should understand that threats are only credible if 4 conditions are met. First, the source, the person issuing the threat, needs to be in a position where they can administer the punishment. So if I make a threat, but you don't think that I'm going to be able to do anything to actually carry out my threat, then it's not going to be an effective tactic. Secondly, a threat would be credible if the source appears willing to actually invoke the punishment. So it's one thing to make the threat, it's quite another thing to be willing to carry it out. Not just able to carry it out, but willing to carry it out. So in my relationship, if I threaten to leave, but I don't really want to leave, then I may not be willing to carry out the threat, and that makes the threat meaningless. Third, the punishment that I am threatening needs to be something that is seen as a thing that should be avoided. So if in fact I say, well, I'm going to leave and you're actually happy for me to go, then that doesn't represent much of a threat either. And that means that threats are effective only if the sanction is something that that threatened party really wants to avoid. Now, while a dominating conflict style can actually be productive at times if a person keeps the importance of the relationship and the other party in mind, there are a whole category of conflict actions that are always going to be harmful to the relationship because they're harmful to the other party. These choices are much more extreme than a dominating conflict style, and they're always going to lead to negative outcomes. They violate the core principles of what it means to be an effective communicator, and they're always based on a win-lose approach to conflict. Now, the first two, verbal aggression and verbal abuse, are forms of communication violence because the person who engages in verbal aggression or verbal abuse attacks the other person by attacking their self-concept. So verbal aggressiveness and verbal abuse often include things like character attacks or insults, but also teasing or making fun of another person, and also profanity. These are all forms of verbal aggression. And what makes verbal aggression particularly damaging, in part, is that many people resort to this as their kind of first line of defense when they feel themselves to be threatened in a conflict. So people engage in struggle and they immediately begin to verbally attack the other person with abusive language. So verbal abuse and aggressiveness can be anything from telling a person you think they're stupid or ugly to suggesting that a person engage in a self-damaging behavior like, why don't you step in the path of that oncoming bus? Now, the more important your relationship with another person, the more harmful those damaging words are going to be. Over a longer period of time, verbal aggression and verbal abuse can become a part of a pattern of ongoing and persistent badgering and harassment and sort of psychological terror that is referred to often as bullying. And bullying can occur in any social setting, but two common social settings include the internet, where we talk about cyberbullies, and workplace, where people often engage in repeated or persistent patterns of negative workplace behavior. And with regard to workplace bullying, what often ends up happening is the person who is the subject of the bullying becomes much less effective at their job. It can also have a negative impact on their family function. And the poor job performance can also lead to damage to an organizational reputation. So bullying at work takes many forms. Supervisors sometimes abuse or bully their subordinates. Sometimes same level workers gang up on another party, and sometimes same level workers will just harass or torment peers. And the thing about bullying is that it often begins really as just a type of incivility. So we don't have to be engaged in a conflict to have bullying become a part of the pattern at work. Incivility at work over time can develop into bullying as repeated long-term acts begin to wear down and damage the character, isolate the character of the person who's being bullied. Now, violence can be thought of as any kind of verbal or physical strategy that is structured to convince or control or force other people to comply with your point of view. Violence occurs when conflict interactions move beyond threats into verbal abuse and verbal aggressiveness, and then from there into physical aggressiveness. Violence occurs often in the home, but it can also occur on dates and in the workplace. And you read quite a number of interesting research studies about violence. Well, the thing about violence is that we often engage in patterns of violence, and there are 5 basic tenets of violence that are based on some of this research that you read. The first is that physical aggression is almost always preceded by verbal aggression. So a person doesn't simply launch into physical abuse without an underlying verbal exchange with another person, and then that verbal exchange escalates to a point when physical abuse can occur. Secondly, violence between 2 intimate parties is often reciprocal, and what that means is that both parties participate in the aggression. Usually one person will engage perhaps in some kind of verbal violence, and then that causes the other party to respond in kind, and that sets off an escalatory conflict spiral. Third, women and children tend to suffer many more injuries as largely a function of the fact that they tend to be smaller and less physically strong. Fourth, victims of abuse are often in a no-win situation, because by the time you're in that kind of setting, it can be very difficult, first of all, to take action against a stronger or a more violent person. Secondly, it can become very difficult to leave because the perpetrator may control your ability to get out of the room, out of the house. Often, abusers will actually escalate their control tactics anytime victims try to leave, and this is particularly dangerous because more domestic abuse victims are killed when they are trying to leave a situation than at any other time. Interestingly, perpetrators of violence and victims have very different narratives that describe the violence that happened. Perpetrators tend to see any individual encounter as a brief episode, very uncharacteristic for themselves. Doesn't really have anything to do with what's going on today. Victims, however, tend to see every violent episode as part of a long-term abuse, and they see very harmful consequences and feel lasting pain as a result of the encounter. And of course, these discrepancies in accounts of violence often lead to underreporting of violence. So while it can be helpful to study the variety of conflict styles and conflict strategies that people can use, it's important to understand that you cannot think only about those individual styles in isolation, because, as my mother used to say, it takes 2 to tango. In other words, the interlocking interaction of 2 or more people, who, however many people are involved in the conflict, are going to determine the outcome of that conflict. And we also need to recognize then that every conflict interaction is unique. However, there are 2 patterns of interlocking behaviors that we should think about. The first is the complementary pattern, and the second is the symmetrical pattern. Complementary patterns are pairs of tactics or styles that are different from one another, but that are mutually reinforcing. So the example given in the book is if one person tries to engage and talk about a conflict while the other person avoids, then each one's move reinforces the moves made by the other. So I engage and you avoid, and then I feel like I need to engage more to get you to engage, but you feel threatened by my more aggressive tone, and so you pull back even more. And so this creates a spiral with each of us magnifying that conflict response in the other. And the second type of pattern is the symmetrical pattern, and this occurs when both participants